Hey guys, so we're not going to have prep class tonight. I'm feeling a little under the weather, and so uh, we're just going to go ahead and cancel. But I will make this recording, kind of walking us through this week's lesson. This week we are skipping ahead a little bit from where we were last week. We're now in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through the end of chapter 15, which it should be a smaller chunk than some of the chunks we have been biting off. At least in uh, the complexity, if nothing else, is a lot less. And so we can kind of slow down and, if you need to, revisit some of the things that you've already touched on or maybe you've sped through. Um, but as we have been doing, what we have is uh, two apostles, and we're on to the Judases. Um, we outside of Judas Iscariot, Judas, not named Iscariot, as John's Gospel names him, or sometimes he's referred to as Thaddeus or Jude. We don't know much about him. He sometimes is confused with Jude, the brother of Christ, or Jude, the author of the Epistle of Jude, um, which many doubt was written by the Apostle Jude. However, there is always a possibility. Um, But Thaddeus or the Apostle Jude, um, we know a few things about him, but not a whole lot. Um, and on the other hand, our other apostle is Judas Iscariot. He is still an apostle. He was a member of the 12, and this is still before his betrayal. So, because of his betrayal, many of the church traditions we have around him uh, recognize that he was probably someone who tended to money in some way or form, because and that was his weakness, was greed. Um, and then you have his focus is consumed mostly on um, ways to get more money or uh, planning or doing all these other steps that some might not consider to be beneficial. Um, However, both are still considered apostles and can be considered examples of good disciples too. Even though of these betrayed Jesus, the idea is still there that um, they were diligent followers in one way or another, and that they've both been given the same status um, in the eyes of God, um, or at least were at one time. I'm not going to really weigh into the debate on where Judas Iscariot is, because that is not what I've been tasked with doing. Instead, I've tasked myself with working us through the Gospel of Luke. And so this week we get into another one of those sections where Jesus is describing um, what it means to be a disciple and the cost of being a disciple. And once again, he uses harsh language. Uh, and this is language that we um, see. It's kind of ramped up since the last time we've had this conversation or had a passage like this, where instead of just someone who despises and goes against the things of his family, now it's someone who hates their family, their friends, their possessions, their own life. And it's important to note that this is probably hyperbole. It's not one of those things where Jesus is probably taking this pretty lightly. However, um, he is using a little exaggeration um, because we are supposed to love one another. So to be told to hate people seems a little odd. But the point is Jesus is circling this idea of if we are consumed with our own worldly desires, our worldly relationships, that's going to distract us from the mission of God. If we are more concerned and we, every time is asked of us by our best friends to do something and we drop everything, is that really helping us do the service to the kingdom? Um, if every time someone comes to us with a question and we drop it immediately, that's not doing the will of God necessarily. Instead, what we're seeing here is Jesus saying, "You're going to look like you hate them. Um, it's going to be hard because you're gonna have to make that cut off and say, no, I can't be that person you're expecting me to be." However, that's what Jesus is saying is you're fully committed uh, to being a disciple of Christ now, and that lifestyle is something that is a little harsh to worldly lifestyles. And so that's kind of the message he gets here. And then he kind of transitions out of this section. This is the last couple of verses of chapter 14. We see is this mini analogy, mini parable, whatever you want to call it, of he's making a transition between what he is, what he has talked about with his disciples, and with that passage in chapter before, with what it means to be a disciple, the cost of discipleship, to then what he will talk about in chapter 15 with the three parable of the lost and the found. Um, so what we see here is he's making this transition of he's comparing um, his disciples to salt. In Matthew's gospel, it's a little bit more explicit. However, here uh, it still is, uh, given the context, it's still referencing uh, the disciples as being the salt. What we see here is he's describing how everything has a good and designed purpose. Even salt does. And salt's good purpose is to make food more flavorful. Um, However, if it were to lose its saltiness, it can no longer fulfill that purpose. And even worse, it can't even do the other uh, tasks it might have been able to be used as, like salting the ground um, um, uh, or anything else. Um, Likewise, Jesus is pointing to his disciples and saying, if you were to lose the thing that makes you distinct, the thing that makes you a disciple, most importantly, if you lose your relationship with me, um, me being Christ, um, not saying I am Christ, but Christ is the one speaking. Christ is saying, if you were to lose the relationship that you have with me, um, you'll become like salt who's lost its saltiness, which is good for nothing, and will be cast out. Um, Likewise, if a disciple or a follower of Christ, or however we want to put it, loses their relationship with Christ, that same idea of the one defining good aspect, the thing that you were designed to do, if you can no longer do that, well, now it's even affected you to where you can't do the other things that are expected of you either. But then he transitions into three parables. Whereas um, we had a crowd at the start of this week's lesson, chapter 14. Now the crowd is starting to divide out, or at least it's in some way apparent that the Pharisees are making themselves more distinct compared to the uh, sinners and tax collectors, um, because they start to grumble, and Jesus clearly takes note because he begins to teach them. And what we see is he talks to these Pharisees and this entire crowd with three very specific um, parables that maybe not everyone would fit in with just one of them, but everyone fits in with all three somehow. The first being the parable of the lost sheep and the good shepherd. We see this a couple times in the other gospels, but this parable, um, it's the it's a pretty famous parable. I don't think I need to go super in detail about what's going on here. Um, a shepherd is tending to a flock of 100 sheep. One one wanders off and is lost, and the shepherd leaves the 99 to go find the one. Um, it is important to note that um, in this parable, one, it's important to note Jesus is using shepherd metaphors to kind of address this crowd, which is interesting because not everyone would have been a shepherd. Actually, a lot of them wouldn't have. Um, but uh, Israel has a distinctly agrarian, and it's an interesting dynamic with the agricultural, uh, like the agricultural capabilities, agricultural, um, uh, the agricultural culture drove so much of what the Israelites experienced. And so here, um, even if you were a Pharisee, you would have known what a shepherd does, what a shepherd is required to do. Um, some may have even been Pharisees that had to go hire shepherds to go raise the sheep for either synagogues or temples or whatever. That's not really the point um, I'm trying to make. But the point I'm trying to make is there's this distinct understanding that even though many of them were not shepherds, they would have known what a shepherd does. Um, and kind of the significance of a shepherd leaving 99 sheep by themselves to go find the one. And so we even see that. But going forward, Jesus then tells a second parable of a woman um, who's lost one of her 10 silver coins. Um, I didn't include this in the notes, but this would have been most likely a reference to a dowry price. Um, However, there's also some who will argue that this woman is unmarried, and so she has just lost a coin, and so that is well one of her 10 silver coins, which means she has lost a tenth of her wealth, and basically, and that's a tenth of all the money she has to spend on food and pay taxes and shelter and all of that, and she probably um, if this is a single, either widow or unmarried woman, uh, she's expecting this to last almost an entire year, if not more, um, based on what she has. Anyway, she's lost this coin, and similar to the shepherd, Jesus uses the imagery of these are two individuals who are the lows, the lows. I'm sure the Pharisees got insulted just being compared to them or listening to a story about them. But even uh, Christ goes on to say that even the widow or this woman, not necessarily a widow, this woman, once she's lost this coin, she tears her house apart. She leaves no stone unturned. She cleans out her house. She sweeps the floors, hoping to find this coin. And when she does, she becomes overwhelmed. She becomes overjoyed. Um, and he compares this, just like the parable with the good shepherd, as this is how God reacts um, when uh, someone who is lost comes into the fold. And probably the most famous one and the most um, memorable one, at least for some people, is the parable of the prodigal son. We know the story pretty well. There's two sons and there's one father. The youngest son goes to his father and he's kind of arrogant and selfish and says, I want you to give me what is due to me now, before you're dead, before even my brother has a chance to claim his inheritance. I want you to give me what's mine now, so I may leave and become my own person. So the son goes and leaves his father. He ends up using his wealth that he didn't work for necessarily, and he blows it all. Um, Whether it's on partying, it's on all these different things like alcohol, uh, gambling, whatever you can think of. Um, a lot of what we struggle with, or what people would spend their money on, would also now would still be uh, would have been something that even people back then struggled with. However, what we see is he loses so much of his wealth that he has to then come to uh, humble himself, and he kind of the language is kind of unclear whether he's just been enlisted into a servant's as being a servant, or is he have gambled his uh, the right to be a servant away to someone, uh, or has he actually sold himself physically into slavery? Um, the language is unclear. All would have been possible, uh, or possible ways that he did this, especially since he's clearly a foreigner in whatever area he is in, because the idea is this is a Jewish man uh, who's now about to be stuck amongst pigs, feeding them. However, the idea here is he's hungry. He's getting so hungry that he's willing to eat the pods um, that fall off the trees that he's supposed to feed to the pigs. And the idea is, yeah, he's getting fed, but he is being taken care of so poorly, where it's only meeting his bare minimums, that he hungers for these pods. He's looking at the pods as this is this is the ribeye um, compared to what I'm being fed, which goes a long way to show um, just how poorly he was being treated, which goes into the idea of why some people guess or will argue that this is a he's making he's been sold into slavery, or he's being treated more as a slave than a servant. Um, and so the idea here is, while he's having this revelation, he comes to the conclusion that if I could, if I was sold as a slave to my father, or if I was a servant in my father's house, um, I would have been treated far better than this. And so he comes to the determination that he's going to leave his current master and become a master to his father. So clearly, there's some flexibility in whatever living arrangement he has. However, it's probably costing him whatever he has left, pretty much. And so he goes into his father, and he's already been practicing what he's going to say to his father, begging for forgiveness, um, begging for the scraps off his table, um, and and yet when his father sees him coming up the path, his father runs to him, grabs him, wraps him up in his arms, puts a robe on him, puts his signet ring on him, um, kind of as a possession, which would have been seen as a, at least to a Greek audience, as a moment of marking basically ownership, not in a negative way, but in a way of inheritance. The idea is um, when a Greek or Roman boy would come of age, they would be, and they are proving themselves to their father or their adoptive father, because we see even with the Caesars, their biological sons were often replaced with adoptive sons. And so their adoptive sons or biological sons would go through the same process of being wrapped and marked as a uh, by this practice of putting your cloak and your ring on them, and is marking them as, this is my family, this is my son, this is my blood. Um, no one else can deny it. And so that's what the father here is doing. And he's so excited that he calls for the fattened calf to be slaughtered. This would have been significant because the fattened calf was always supposed to be saved for the highest of celebrations, for weddings, for special life uh, events. Um, Even funerals were, it was supposed to be the fattened calf. But here, likewise, the father says, I'm celebrating my son's return from death. he was dead and now he's alive. Um, and so that's a really impactful part of the story. But then the older brother comes back and he's a little jealous, and this is probably the part where we can all kind of point to this is definitely a reference to the Pharisees. But this is the older brother who, though he probably has done wrong, hasn't left his father, who has tried his best to do what was right in the eyes of his father, and yet he looks and sees, and it appears that his brother is being celebrated for all the wrong he has done. And it's pointed out, and this is kind of where it ends of, I'm not celebrating my son for all the wrong he's done. I'm celebrating because my son was dead and now he's alive. I think that somewhat applies to what we're seeing um, with God and the Pharisees, and you could even say the demons and the devil. And they say, uh, if we want to take this into a more divine realm discussion, just sticking with the Pharisees, Jesus is pointing to the Pharisees and saying, "These sinners, these tax collectors who are coming to me, I'm embracing them just as this Father has, and I'm not celebrating their sins. I'm not celebrating all the things they've done wrong. I'm celebrating because they were dead in their trespasses to sin, and now they are alive because they are with me." Likewise, you could take this into a discussion of the divine realm, and you could make the argument of God telling Satan, I'm not celebrating the sins. I'm not changing the rules all of a sudden. I, yes, I did cast you out, Satan, because you broke my rules. I'm not celebrating because these humans did it, broke the rules, and I've changed my mind. They broke the rules, and there's still going to be consequences for that. I'm celebrating because they were apart from me and they have returned to me. And so we have that kind of a discussion point here. But all throughout this week, kind of the lesson here is this this shift. The shift is occurring to where even Christ in his parables is starting to speak specifically about things that are going to happen and how it's going to be with him dead. Um, a lot of you could point to these parables, and it's talking about a time when we'll be accepted before God because of our faith in our baptism and all that. Well, at this point, he's telling this to a crowd who doesn't have anything like that yet because he hasn't died yet. And so it's just one of those that we can clearly see there's a shift and there's a change coming down the line. But what I kind of wanted to challenge us with is to kind of start to think of ways we can have these discussions with individuals um, about the message. And so the idea is, who do you know that might benefit from hearing these parables, and how might you be able to share this message this week? Part of this being a disciple is knowing and loving and glorifying God, but also part of it is going and talking to people and spreading the message. Um, so this week, I challenge you to go spread the message, but also to take this and make it your own, and do what you will with it. Thank you.